Hello, welcome to Management 201. Today we're talking about managing diversity in a global environment, and we will talk about different kinds of diverse environments that businesses deal with. Some of that has to do with globalization, but other things have to do with entirely domestic issues like gender diversity and age discrimination and all of that. So I will start by talking about types of businesses with respect to globalization. Most businesses that we think about, that we know personally, are probably classified as domestic. Those are the businesses that really conduct their operations in only one country. They operate locally, they do not sell internationally, they may still source some of their products, some of their inputs from overseas, but with respect to where the business is focused, located, there's clearly within a certain country. And in countries like the United States, it is fairly easy to be a domestic business because the domestic market is so huge. Some European countries, it is almost impossible to operate within those narrowly defined national boundaries. And given the level of integration that you see in the European Union, businesses may actually be created global. This is what we call born global kind of businesses. So still in the States, domestic businesses are probably the typical form. We also may talk about international businesses. They are based mostly in one country, but do business in other countries. So if you sell overseas, but all of your operations are domestic, that would be an example of an international entity. So oftentimes businesses go international without fully realizing that they are international, especially if you operate in the online, the web environment. You have no idea where your customers are coming from. Some of the educational institutions, especially with respect to their online offerings, they tap global markets, even though they try to target entitled domestic students. Software, think about that, right? So the entire world becomes your playground, but in fact, you conduct your operations purely domestically, right? You do not place development centers internationally. You only use English language for the products that you create. Still, the market is such that some of your customers are located elsewhere, and that makes you an international business. Multinational is one step further or one level deeper in this whole internationalization continuum. There you would have ownership and operations in two or more countries. So when it comes to the ownership, that definitely talks about your very serious commitment to sourcing best inputs, to maybe hire and best people wherever they allocated. It is true for in some industries more than in others. So for many software development firms, they will have a development team located in India. For many firms, even if it has nothing to do with high tech, they would have facilities located around the world so that people can work on the projects 24/7. Right? So when the day ends here, the day just starts elsewhere. And if you're able to integrate those teams seamlessly, or at least more or less effectively, you know that you'll be able to do the project much faster, and your customers will be happy because of that and will probably pay you some premiums. And finally, there are some businesses that are classified as transnational. So in that case, businesses really do not care about geographic barriers. They effectively treat the whole world as their market. They locate operations in different countries. They source multiple components for the same final product in different countries. If you think of a business like IKEA, I don't know if you've ever shopped at IKEA, but it's interesting if you do. When you unpack the box, read where each of the parts come from. It's not uncommon to see in a chair or a table, a desk, some parts coming from Poland, other parts coming from Lithuania, something else coming from China or the Philippines or India, whatever the case might be. And yet it all becomes a part of that same box. So for those businesses where you place operations is subject to search for efficiency gains, maybe some location advantages. So the concept of space and national boundaries is meaningless. And that is probably the most developed internationalization strategy that you can find. Uh, those businesses are still few and far between. Again, most businesses you will be dealing with are purely domestic, but with the development of technologies, many of them, without realizing what's going on, are becoming international. And as industries integrate, as companies integrate vertically and geographically, many of those international businesses become multinational to eventually become transnational firms. Um, for those domestic businesses, there are two philosophical challenges they deal with, and not just for businesses, for individuals as well. And those are parochialism and ethnocentrism, which really, especially parochialism, deal with the way you approach the world. With parochialism, you really do have a narrow focus, seeing things solely from your own perspective. It's uh, it's simply being not interested in the rest of the world, not willing to explore what lies beyond whatever location you're in. And you would think that the world is so integrated right now that for many people and for many companies, this is a thing of the past. Sadly, that is not true. There are many people, even now, living in the States who have never left their state, let alone, talk about international travel. There are many businesses that find that local opportunity and stick with it, and that's that. They are not exploring what is available elsewhere. They are not interested in communicating to the outside world. They are not interested in having the world communicate to them and teaching them some of the lessons. Ethnocentrism is a slightly different thing. So here, you simply have a preference for your own, right? Then you regard your own ethnic group or culture as superior to others. And if that's the case, and if you come from this perspective, then you may travel, right? You may sample different products that come from someplace else, but you are unwilling to admit that something that comes from elsewhere could be superior to what you have in the house. And if you follow this ethnocentric mentality, you are robbing yourself from access to some of the better products, better services, better technologies, wider markets. So within any population, you would have a group of people that is ethnocentric or even parochial. And I think as a business manager, you try to educate the people around you. You definitely try not to be that yourself, but you also try to build your business in a way where opportunities are globally available or even nationally, but beyond your sort of narrowly defined place. So you want to pay attention to those opportunities as well and exploit them if possible. Speaking of global processes. Foreign trade is a thing in itself. It's not as easy to conduct business internationally as it is domestically, and there are several reasons to that. Right, first of all, there are trade barriers that different countries erect that make it hard for entrants from elsewhere to go to your domestic market. And by the same token, whenever you try to go to a different place, there will be those protective mechanisms that prevent you from competing with their domestic businesses. There are four different kinds of trade barriers that you need to know about. One is embargo. So embargo simply means that you cannot conduct business with that country, right? That market is completely closed off for you. So if you think about Cuba, Cuba is a subject to embargo imposed by the United States. It is not possible, with very few exceptions to U.S. businesses, to conduct business in Cuba, which means there are many opportunities that remain unavailable, inaccessible to the U.S. companies. It definitely hurts Cuba. It also hurts the United States. So, in the ideal world, embargoes would not exist. Quota is another way to protect domestic market. When a government institutes a quota for certain product, they would say, okay, we can buy this much of stuff in this industry, in this market from country A, but no more. Anything that comes over the quota is subject to some tax or some payments or tariffs, and we'll talk about tariffs in a few minutes. So it opens up the market somewhat, but it protects the domestic market from being flooded by foreign entrants. And the idea here is that by allowing foreign entry but controlling the extent, you sort of give incentive to your domestic companies to learn from what the rest of the world has achieved, yet you do not allow the domestic manufacturers to be beaten by more efficient entrants from elsewhere until and unless they adjust their own level of effectiveness to what can be found elsewhere in the world. Much of the global negotiations between the US and China at the moment have to do with quotas. Right? Have to do with how much of stuff from each country can be exported or imported without um, having to pay additional fees to facilitate the transaction and trade. So again, at some level, on a global level, this is definitely disruptive. There are reasons that local governments have, national governments have for imposing quotas, but you know, all in all, this is not a good idea to encourage competitiveness in a global sense. Subsidies are payments that national governments give to their local producers, manufacturers, so as to make their competition easier against global players. For instance, you want to encourage global farming, let's say sustainable farming. You may subsidize, like the US does, subsidize corn farmers. They actually give them the money so that their final product is competitive and accessible as an input to a lot of other industries. And this is why we have this corn syrup that many companies use instead of sugar as the sweetening agent. This is why corn is used to produce, biodiesel, biofuel, and because the price that you pay as a consumer has been subsidized through the use of government funds. And by the same token, if you subsidize the domestic producer, you make it harder for international entrants to compete with their unsubsidized products against what has been subsidized domestically. And then finally, tariffs. Tariffs are basically like tax. You may put tariffs on imports into your country so that whenever some product that competes with your domestic one comes in, whoever brings it in has to pay some tariff on top of it, which makes this foreign product more expensive than it could have been, and that increases competitiveness of your domestic business. Whether or not this protection is actually good for your domestic industry is a big question, but you see that the United States has imposed tariffs against China in many different industries and many product categories. China is doing the same against US exports. And this is sort of this old way of regulating foreign trade. But as we see up until now, it's still being used. There are different mechanisms and agreements that countries create to facilitate global trade, right? To reduce, to eliminate those trade barriers, because arguably, if the entire world is free for you to sell your stuff, that should help you with economies of scale, with learning opportunities, and that will make life better for everyone else. And there is this one mega agreement that exists at the global level, the so-called World Trade Organization, or WTO. It has more than 100 countries who signed it, who've been admitted. The process of being admitted into this agreement into this organization is somewhat political, but once you become a member of organization, you know you have all the protection against questionable practices by national governments, against those trade barriers that they could have put in place. And at the same time, you know that you are to treat foreign manufacturers or exporters in the same way, right? You have to treat them fairly. You do not erect trade barriers. This facilitates global trade. In addition to that, there are different trade agreements that have been created not globally, but sort of locally among neighboring countries, among countries that maybe share some borders or even sometimes history. So, the one you're probably most familiar with used to be called NAFTA, North America Free Trade Agreement. The Trump administration has renegotiated it recently. It is replaced now by the USMCA, which is, I guess, US, Mexico, and Canada agreement. It does eliminate a lot of, tariffs, quotas. It does facilitate trade between these three countries. It makes it a lot easier for skilled people to move across countries, definitely with respect to Canada and the US, and less so with respect to Mexico. And generally, that is a good thing that facilitates all those global processes and economic development within the countries that signed it. There's a similar agreement in Central America, this CAFTA, CAFTA-DR. So Central America Free Trade Agreement, and DR, I believe, stands for the Dominican Republic. There's European Union, which is a quasi-state existing in Europe, currently has, I know, 27, 29 member states, and it's all single market. A firm from any of those countries can do business with any other country seamlessly. There's migration of people across countries, which facilitates a lot of developmental processes and allows individuals to find the best positions for themselves without having to go through visas and work permits and whatnot. So it's good for the people. It's also good for the businesses because if there's a shortage in a specific area and wages start going up, they can attract qualified workers from elsewhere much faster and without the red tape than would have been otherwise. There are several trading agreements in Asia. There's recently been this Trans-Pacific Agreement negotiated, but unfortunately, the Trump administration has decided to do away with it. So now there are talks that will be brought back to life. But again, countries do a great number of things to facilitate global trade, make it more equitable, make it easy, and provide extra opportunities for their own businesses and their own people. The big thing, however, with respect to global trade is that different countries have independent financial systems, independent monetary systems, and they have their own currencies, right? Except Europe, that has introduced its own currency jointly issued, jointly shared by the member states. Most other countries have their own currency they operate. And what it means is that because those currencies are subject to exchange, exchange rates do fluctuate. So there's sort of the official exchange rate that tells you how much of one currency you can buy for one unit of another currency. And the market seems to be in agreement that this is what it is. Well, in fact, those exchange rates are not economically justifiable in each and every case. And there's a thing that helps you make more, you've probably heard of the purchasing power parity. If you look at how much of stuff domestically you can buy, with, let's say, for $100 in the US, you can buy this much stuff. For 100 rubles in Russia, you can buy that much stuff. By comparing that, or by comparing, how much the same package will cost in country A and country B, you can come to this exchange rate as measured by a specific product group. And one really interesting way to think about it is the so-called Big Mac index. So you try to see how much a Big Mac, right, a McDonald's product, would be worth or would cost in the United States, where US dollar is used, and in any other country in local currency. And by comparing those, you can derive this Big Mac index that basically tells you the fair exchange rate for a pair of currencies. And more often than not, it differs drastically from what the official financially derived exchange rate is, which opens up plenty of opportunities for businesses that are smart to profit from what is known arbitrage, where you can buy resources here at a lower price, you're selling there at a higher price, making use of this suboptimal exchange rates that still exist to this day across most countries in the world. Now, obviously, diversity is not limited to just international aspects. There are aspects of diversity in the workplace that could be observed in any company, regardless of whether it's domestic, international, multinational, or transnational. And those elements of diversity include things like age and generational diversity, gender and sexual orientation diversity, race and ethnicity, disability ability, religion, and a great number of other things. And the problem, I guess, that most businesses face is people tend to like people who look like them. People inherently do not appreciate diversity much. So, whenever there is any kind of minority, the natural inclination for the majority people would be to discriminate against them. And there are several mechanisms put in place by government agencies to protect minorities against discrimination. And those characteristics that matter for such protection, again, they're all listed here. Things like race and ethnicity, disability, age and generation. Many of those categories that would have otherwise been discriminated against are actually protected by the law. Now, with respect to age and generational differences, well, first of all, yes, there is this provision that says, you cannot really discriminate against people who are 40 years and older. So when you apply for jobs, oftentimes there would be a question, are you at least 40 years of age? Yes or no? And if you choose yes, and if you are not the one who's chosen for the final opportunity, and you feel like you're equally qualified, you could stake a claim that you've been discriminated against based on age. Happens all the time. Sometimes it's sort of impossible to prove, but we all know it's there. And currently, we live in a really interesting time when there are five distinct group of people based on their generational membership, if you will. And each of those groups of people has their own desires for, what's important to them, what's not, the career path they choose, and they all work together, right? Because people live longer, and because healthcare is decent enough now to keep people active longer, there are all those five different generations competing for the same jobs, trying to work together And for you as a manager, and this is a management course, it is absolutely essential to acknowledge the differences, to know what it is that motivates each of those distinct groups of individuals, and how to structure your company operations in a way where you use each of those in the best way possible, and you keep them motivated and you keep them economically productive. So here we talk about generations such as the traditionalists. Those are people born, between 1925 1945. Sometimes they also call the silent generation. You have baby boomers, people born between 1946 1964. You have Generation X, 1965 to 1980, Generation Y, or millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, and currently you have Generation Z, those people born in 97 and later, who are already a part of the workforce. And if you think about your workforce consistent of baby boomers and Generation Z, it's very hard to create a policy, labor policy, that would appeal to them equally. Right? So for people who are baby boomers or maybe the traditionalists, the silent generation, they definitely value, stability. They value traditional career path. They work hard. They don't mind working longer hours if that is necessary. For people like millennials and Gen Z, well, they value their freedom. They don't mind working as freelancers. Personal development is probably more important to them at many junctures in their career than stability. And so, how you do that, how you manage those groups, is a non-trivial question. So I encourage you to check your textbook, and does provide some advice to that effect. But definitely, you will cover that to a much larger extent in your HR classes, which will be taken later on. As I said, diversity means that the majority tends to um, oppress minority, if you will. And there are different policies that are put in place by the government to address this problem. And generally, if you think about the US, it has been thought of as a melting pot, right? People come from anywhere in the world and then they become Americans, right? They all of a sudden share those common values and they motivated by the same things. It is no longer true necessarily, right? It's no longer the case. People become sort of less alike than was the case previously. Um, a lot of it has to do with the development of the internet, right? So even if you come to the US now, you can still easily connect to the people that you left behind. You can watch your national media, you can listen to the music, you can be in the know with respect to anything and everything that happens back home. And, there are those ethnic communities that live together in the United States to the point where a lot of people don't even have to learn the language. So that melting pot mentality that we tend to associate with the United States becomes a lot less pronounced. It is still a lot more pronounced than in some other places like Canada, where they do celebrate multiculturalism and they uphold it, they promote it consciously. So here we are a lot more of a melting pot than Canada, but it becomes a lot less pronounced and people cling to their roots a lot longer and a lot stronger than was the case previously. So, with this diversity and the possibility for discrimination, there comes the policy of affirmative action. So, this is where the government explicitly says you cannot discriminate against this, you cannot discriminate against that. There are multiple categories established, right? So, race, gender, age, military service, and all of that. And the government tries very hard to ensure that there's no discrimination. There are policies in place that those organizations have specific bodies, specific boards that oversee that there is no discrimination. And then if there are some instances of discrimination, there's a way for affected employees to redress the balance, to seek some, I don't know, some payoffs or some opportunities that without those policies would not have been available. But it's not just the government action, such as affirmative action, that change the face of the workforce. There's also this notion of inclusion, where rather than just being compliant with what the government says, many companies actually consciously try to be inclusive. They consciously welcome diversity. They try to, appreciate people for who they are and not blame them for something that they are not. So I think there's been a cultural change, a cultural shift in the US where inclusion becomes sort of the expectation. And to me, this looks very encouraging. I hope that this move towards inclusion will help us one day achieve a state where everybody can actually realize their own potential, regardless of what they are, how they look, and the accent that their speech has. It is important to be personally inclusive, fight against discrimination, and the other thing is, even if we do not discriminate openly, many of us are guilty of stereotyping people. When you see a person that belongs to a different group than you associate certain characteristics with that group that the person seemingly belongs to, and then you treat that person as if he or she, uh, display those characteristics. So you look at certain racial minorities and you say, oh, they this and that. You look at a very qualified woman applicant for a position and you sort of discount her qualifications because maybe, you grew up in the environment where all the leadership positions were dominated by males. You hear a specific accent and you say, well, he's this and that. You judge the person before you know the person. That's the dangerous part, right? So that's the stereotyping. With respect to global diversity, obviously countries differ on a great number of dimensions, and cultures that are prevalent in those countries. There are also very many differences, but there is a systematic way of analyzing those differences, of making sense of those differences, and sort of grouping those countries and cultures along these dimensions. There's been several attempts to make sense of the global diversity. The person who has probably done the most for our understanding of global differences is Hofstede. He started his work in the early 80s, I believe, and through his work, he has identified initially four characteristics that can really tell you a lot about cultural differences. And then later on, he added the fifth one. So the initial characteristics he identified were power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, and uncertainty avoidance. To that, later on, he also added long term orientation. So, what does that mean? Power distance means the extent to which you defer, to which you respect this hierarchical power. And like in the States, it's fairly easy for you guys to call your professors by the first name, for employees to talk maybe to the company president. There's no barrier. Other countries, you would never go a level above, right? So you'll never jump over your supervisor to talk to his supervisor. So, you would listen very carefully for what your boss tells you. You'll do exactly as you said. Some countries, you bow and you do as you're told. So that is definitely what separates countries, what makes them distinct. Individualism versus collectivism tells about what is of primary importance to a typical person. Some countries, like the United States, are very high on individualism. Right? People are motivated by something that makes them, rich, powerful, which allows them to enjoy their life, regardless of how that affects their environment, their friends, the people around them. So, if you are smart, then you're supposed to do well for yourself and maybe your family. Collectivistic cultures are motivated by an entirely different set of values. They do not think necessarily about advancing, each person would not think about advancing their own case. They would think about their community. Is it good for the community? If I have, too much of something, I can share. If I'm in trouble, I can count on my community to help me out. So that, again, is a very different kind of situation you might find yourself in, and that tells us a lot about national cultures. Masculinity versus femininity, those are the original terms. They are now replaced with assertiveness versus nurturing. Basically tells you if in a certain culture, I guess the outcome is more important than the process. So cultures that are result oriented, goal oriented, where you are ready to do whatever it takes to get to the result, those are the masculine culture. Now they called assertive. Cultures that emphasize the process, the alignment, sort of the peace, the agreement, so those nurturing cultures were initially known as feminine cultures, and it actually has nothing to do with gender. For instance, Scandinavian countries are typically high on femininity. So even males there will display much higher level of femininity in terms of their values and appreciating the process than individuals in some other countries where assertiveness is high. So in a way, those are countries where the journey is more important than the destination. And masculine countries would be the ones where just destination is the key. Uncertainty avoidance, in some countries, people do not appreciate uncertainty at all. They're stressed by uncertainty. They want the precise set of rules. They want someone in command who tells them what to do so they know what to expect. And life is really simple that way. Other countries, people are fine with uncertainty, right? So they don't mind trying different things, not knowing what they're gonna get at the end. They do not really appreciate the highly, heavily prescribed set of activities. They like doing their own thing. And not surprisingly, countries that are high on that are low on uncertainty avoidance, that do not mind bearing uncertainty, would be high on the rates of entrepreneurship. Because entrepreneurs, when they start their businesses, there's a huge uncertainty, right? There is a great opportunity for them to lose everything they invest, to put their family lives under strain. So if you are not fine with uncertainty, you would never start your own business. You will prefer working for someone else, having a 8 to 5 job. So, right, it matters a great deal for the economic processes you see in the country. And finally, long-term orientation. That's the dimension that's been added here just recently. Basically tells you, how far ahead you're thinking about. Some cultures, they do not really look too far ahead. The immediate instant gratification sort of is essential. Other countries, other cultures, it's definitely okay for them to think of decades, if not centuries ahead. So China would be an example of that. In Japan, I may have mentioned that Toyota Motor Company, when it was created, the guy behind it came up with a 250-year strategic plan, broken down into 10 smaller chunks. To us here, seems unbelievable, if not ridiculous. To them there, it's definitely okay. And so, as you conduct cross-cultural business, cross-country business, it is very important to realize who you're dealing with because assumptions are critical. Understanding each other's assumptions is critical to having a productive discussion, to having productive processes. If you do not understand what drives this other person, if that person does not understand what's important to you, you would be looking at the same thing, maybe even speaking the same language, but not truly understanding each other. So having this cultural sensitivity um, is very important as you start, breaking out of this parochial viewpoint or ethnocentric viewpoint, and you start working with the rest of the world. I would definitely encourage you to study other cultures, to understand their assumptions, and to feel, to account for that in your economic thinking as you plan, your professional development and future. There's a different framework for analyzing national cultures. Some of the dimensions are distinct from what Hofstad talked about. Some are almost the same. So I'm just going to go over them very briefly, just identify them. But to a significant extent, they are self explanatory. So assertiveness, obviously very similar to masculinity. Future orientation, similar to long term orientation. Gender differences, right? So that talks about the extent to which certain jobs are maybe associated with certain gender and cultural expectations, behavioral expectations that we have of each gender. Uncertainty avoidance, power distance, societal collectivism, in group collectivism. See, it's interesting that societal collectivism and in group collectivism are separated because in some countries you will be absolutely rooting for your group and driven by the group values. But beyond that group, if you look at the society at large, like none of that matters. Whereas in other cultures, the collective values are important at all levels, regardless if it's your small team or village or the country at large. Performance orientation and human orientation again has to do somewhat with the journey versus the destination. So basically, those things that separate culture, they're all related, and it's just different way of slicing them and making sense of the differences. With respect to global management practices, right? If you decide that you want to operate in the sort of in the world as a whole, you don't want to get locked in a specific country, which, as I said, is very true for companies that originated in smaller countries. They almost have to go international. They have to go global from the get-go. There are different pieces that they should incorporate in their strategy to ensure their success. So, one thing they should have is this global management team to make sure that you operate effectively across multiple countries. You should seek input from individuals representing multiple countries. They don't, like not each country we operate should be represented necessarily, but people with a variety of views and experiences should be there. Global operations and products obviously is a big deal. Some countries are very efficient with respect to specific processes. If you locate your operations there, you can benefit from that expertise. You can benefit from logistics. You can benefit from unique historic conditions that help them develop that expertise. You can, exploit some of the benefits, cultural benefits associated with the location. So, if you're in a wine business, then maybe you want to have some operations in France and then something in California and something in Chile and wherever else those wineries are, so that you can source the products that come with a name, that come with this halo around them that allow you to charge more and deliver a better product. Global financing, obviously, financial conditions are very different around the world. and you can access financial resources on much better terms in some places than in others. If you're globally extended, that gives you an opportunity to seek funding across the world to finance your operations, which may also be, globally distributed and benefit from that. In terms of marketing, we will be talking about that in more detail later on this semester. But you have to take these differences across countries into consideration when developing your promotional strategies, your advertising strategies, right? The extent to which you customize your product for each country you go to, that's important. Global technology and R&D. Some countries have unique capabilities in certain areas, and it would make a lot of sense for you to pick the best in each of the countries where you can potentially establish presence. So this is known as innovation arbitrage. You go to places best known for something, you source the best at the best prices from them, and then you combine them to produce a product which would allow you to establish supremacy in the market. Global strategy, obviously, we will talk about that, not in much detail because this is a topic that is discussed a lot more in your strategic management capstone class, the one that you'll be taking in your last semester. But again, there are different considerations that you have here. And if you combine those areas effectively, you're going to build a very successful global company that operates in multiple countries, that sources its products, sources its people from elsewhere, and is globally effective, globally competitive. In terms of different forms of global business, again, depends on the extent to which you want to be incorporated in this global environment. Some of that could be just global sourcing, right? As you manufacture, you source your inputs from elsewhere. And now most of the products, even of the ones manufactured in the United States, will have components that are manufactured in China or somewhere else in Southeast Asia, sometimes in Mexico, sometimes in South America, sometimes in Eastern Europe. So sourcing components, inputs globally is almost expected. Right? It's almost impossible now to find something that is purely US made by US workers using US inputs. So that is sort of the lowest of the low. You can also do importing and exporting, right? So here you actually trade with other countries in finished goods, not just inputs, but finished goods. And that is probably the easiest way for you to start internationalizing, to test the markets overseas as they become available without committing yourself to any physical footprint in those countries, right? So you just ship your stuff. The next level is licensing and franchising. You find a local partner, you share your technologies, you share your way of doing business. You effectively give away your trade secrets to that local party, and then you try to control the quality. So you develop that market using someone else's resources and your own know-how. It exposes you more to some of the risks, but potentially it gives you the payoff that would be not comparable with what you get through simple exporting. Contracting is the next thing, right? So you find local partner, you contract with a partner, and you go along. Strategic alliances and joint ventures. Here you find a partner to whom you are committed long term, right? So unlike just contracting where it's one-off kind of thing. So here you find a partner. You sometimes create a separate entity together with that partner, which would be joint venture, or you do not integrate your businesses, but you start working together, in which case it's called a strategic alliance, to pursue an opportunity that is attractive to both of you, or however many firms there would be, but that none of you would be able to pursue on your own. So it's kind of a win-win kind of situation. And then finally, direct investment is something where if you identify the opportunity in a third country, you go there and you effectively build a facility there from scratch, tailored at that specific opportunity. So you get 100% control by doing that over the opportunity, but obviously it exposes you to the most risk and it costs you the most. So not every opportunity that you may see internationally is a good one, is a fitting one for direct investment. So you have to think really carefully about risks and benefits. And if you do that, then obviously you're going to have a successful business. So that is a very short presentation of the chapter. I hope you find it useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me and ask those questions. Otherwise, guys, please don't forget you have a quiz coming up this Friday. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. Thanks.